In 1931, Britain was on its knees. A loaf of bread might be one of the only foods a family could still count on, while unemployment ripped through shipyards, mills, and coal pits. Families lay awake wondering how to keep 5 children fed on pennies a week. The sandwiches they came up with didn't just fill bellies, they quietly rewired British food history. Sandwich number 17 would become so notorious that some school teachers tried to ban it from lunchboxes. Sandwich number 3 depends on a simple ingredient and process that modern food science only properly started talking about again in recent years. These creations worked so well at keeping working people on their feet that once prosperity returned, the food industry spent decades nudging us to feel ashamed of them and to buy branded products instead. If you knew what your great-grandparents knew, you'd think twice before putting half the things you buy into your trolley at a British supermarket. Hit subscribe because this might completely reset how you see British food and poverty meals. Let's count down the 30 poorest man's sandwiches from the Great Slump that Britain forgot. The condensed milk sandwich sits at number 30. Here, thick, sweetened condensed milk is poured or smeared between slices of soft white bread, turning into a sticky, over-the-top sugar bomb for dockers and shipyard workers who couldn't dream of affording proper meat or cheese. The sugary milk seeps deep into the crumb, transforming the cheapest factory loaf into something that briefly feels indulgent. A single tin, treasured because it keeps without chilling, can be stretched over several days of lunchboxes, each serving delivering enough sugar and calories to drag a worn-out body through another shift. For children allowed to lick the knife or the last streaks from the spoon, this was about as close to dessert as they were going to see that week. At number 29 is the cold chip butty. Last night's chippy leftovers are shoved into buttered bread the next day, eaten cold, limp and salty, and somehow still ranking as peak working-class comfort. Wrapped in paper and stuffed into coat pockets, these butties taste like the echo of a small treat colliding with the hard reality of the following morning. Even once the chips turn soggy, the combination of fat, starch and salt keeps stomachs quiet through long days in the factory, behind the wheel, or on the building site. It's yesterday's fast food, repurposed as today's survival food at no extra cost. Coming in at number 28 is the watercress poor man's bread sandwich. Here, peppery watercress is packed between slices of bread, earning that nickname because the greens were often cheaper and sometimes more available than the bread itself. Street sellers in London and industrial towns once hawked little bundles of cress to workers at dawn. If you had bread, you turned it into a sandwich, and if you didn't, you simply ate the cress as if it were a full meal. Loaded with vitamins and sharp freshness, this bare-bones sandwich quietly kept people healthier than they realized, long before anyone was talking about nutrient-dense superfoods. In 27th place sits the treacle or golden syrup sandwich. This is bread heavily smeared with black treacle or golden syrup, a budget dessert that practically glued children's teeth together and made a single tin last far longer than it had any right to. Mothers learned to spread just enough sticky sweetness to convince their kids they'd had something special. The syrup's intense sugar hit disguised how thinly it was applied. The bread handled the filling duty while the treacle delivered the rush. In tightly packed back-to-backs in terrace streets, treacle sandwiches were both a treat and a financial necessity, turning stale slices into something children would actually eat to the last crumb. At number 26, we find the Marmite sandwich. A thin, almost transparent smear of yeast extract on bread delivers a shock of salt and a dose of B vitamins at times when meat was completely out of reach. Born from brewery byproducts, Marmite became a hidden hero in British pantries, a way to slip something vaguely nutritious onto the plate on days when every other spread had run out. Families taught themselves to scrape so lightly you could nearly see the pattern of the bread beneath, turning one jar into dozens of school lunches. Whether you love it or loathe it, the Marmite sandwich was a very British form of survival food. Ranked 25th is the humble sugar sandwich. You start with buttered bread, then sprinkle it with granulated sugar, and that becomes a lot of children's only pudding during the hardest times. The sugar crystals crunch loudly between their teeth, small bursts of sweetness after long stretches of bland or savory meals. It sounds almost unbelievable now that a slice like this was ever treated as a proper food, but for many kids, it was the only sweet flavor they experienced all week. The combination of butter's fat and the sugar's quick energy kept them going a little longer, even if the adults later tried to blot out how often they resorted to this desperate dessert. Here we hit the first pattern break. This is where the British food story starts to bend. As the Great Slump dragged on and then blurred into the turmoil of war, a wave of cheap spreads, bottled sauces, and imported tins began to change what counted as a normal British sandwich. Before the big brands moved in, most families relied on things like dripping, garden greens, offal, and whatever could be begged, traded, or foraged. When industrial margarine, tinned meats, and heavily advertised jars took over the grocer's shelves, the picture of a proper sandwich shifted from scraping every last bit out of the roasting pan to simply levering open a can. The hard-won skill your great-grandparents had for making something out of almost nothing slowly got edged out by logos, jingles, and colourful labels. At number 24 is the onion and dripping sandwich. Thin rings of raw or lightly fried onion are laid across bread soaked with beef dripping, turning leftover roast fat into a complete meal. The slice gleams with set fat from Sunday's joint, while the onions deliver sharpness and crunch that keep it from tasting like nothing but grease. It's intense to eat and famously potent on the breath, yet for people in the mills, dockyards, and factories, this was the absolute cheapest way to pack in enough calories to keep swinging tools all day. Greasy, pungent, and dirt cheap. That's its entire purpose. Number 23, we have the classic bread and dripping sandwich. After the Sunday roast comes off the table, every drop of cooled fat and jelly is poured into a dish and later spread on bread just like butter. In some households, the meat itself almost plays second fiddle, but the real treasure is the dripping that will flavour breakfasts and packed lunches for the rest of the week. Children bite into slices that still carry the memory of meat and gravy long after the joint has disappeared. Every mouthful is proof that nothing from that costly piece of beef or pork has gone to waste. At number 22 sits the cheese rind sandwich. Once the main block of cheese has been grated, sliced, and eaten, all that remains are the tough rinds. Those hardened ends are carefully scraped, shaved, or gently melted and turned into the only cheese layer in the sandwich. Resourceful cooks soften these stubborn pieces with a little heat or fat, then press them onto bread so everyone gets at least the impression of dairy. For children opening metal lunch tins, a cheese rind sandwich signals that even in a week when a fresh wedge was too expensive, there is still some cheese flavour to be had. Coming in at 21st is the watered-down jam sandwich. Here, jam is either deliberately thinned or spread so faintly that you can practically read print through the slice. With sugar and fruit both costly and tightly rationed, one jar is forced to last as long as possible. Mothers who used to be generous with jam learn to dab and drag the knife, leaving only a slight blush of colour on the bread. It looks at a glance like a treat, but the flavour is mostly flour and yeast, a tiny illusion of luxury used to keep spirits up when the cupboards are close to empty. In 20th place, we find the carrot and cheese sandwich. This is grated carrot, mixed with a modest amount of cheese, then spread thickly on bread as a cheap, healthy filler. In lean years, government campaigns and home economics lessons sang the praises of carrots and urged households to stretch their limited cheese with generous handfuls of orange shreds. The finished sandwich looks abundant and colourful, even though the actual amount of cheese is small. For school children and workers, it brings crunch, colour, and a faint but welcome hint of dairy. At number 19 sits the cabbage and margarine sandwich. Leftover boiled cabbage leaves from the previous night's pot are pressed down onto bread coated with cheap margarine. For families determined to keep some form of green vegetable in every meal, this is how they honour that rule when money is tight. The soft, limp leaves carry the flavor of yesterday's dinner, while the margarine adds just enough fat to help the whole thing slide down. Nobody pretends it's glamorous, but it allows parents to say truthfully that there are still vegetables in the house. Now we reach the second pattern break. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into neat historical overviews. Official British nutrition advice during the slump and the years around it often lived in a completely different world from poor households. Health visitors, charities, and government posters urged families to serve more milk, more fresh fruit, and more leafy greens, foods that were often expensive, rationed, or simply not available in dense industrial districts. Meanwhile, ordinary people kept themselves and their kids upright on things like dripping, cress, condensed milk, cheap bread, and whatever offal or scraps they could get hold of. That gap between polished dietary charts and the everyday reality of survival cooking hasn't entirely gone away. You still see it whenever modern advice assumes everyone can stroll through a farmer's market and cook from scratch every night. Holding 18th place is the mashed potato sandwich. This uses leftover mashed from the evening meal, pressed between slices of bread and sometimes loosened with a spoonful of saved gravy. Potatoes are dependable and satisfying, and any mash remaining after supper is far too precious to throw out. Packed into lunch tins, these sandwiches may look plain, but they hit the stomach like a brick, in a comforting way, keeping children and adults going through long days with nothing but layers of spuds and bread. It's pure starch on starch, carefully calculated to keep hunger at bay. At number 17, we have the cold bubble and squeak sandwich. Yesterday's fried mixture of cabbage and potato, known as bubble and squeak, is cooled overnight and then squashed into bread the next morning. The crispy edges soften once they meet the crumb, but the flavors of browned veg, leftover fat, and potato still shine through. For many families, this is simply the natural life cycle of a Sunday joint. Roast on Sunday, bubble and squeak on Monday, bubble and squeak sandwiches on Tuesday. Colleagues might complain about the cabbage smell in cramped classrooms or offices, but the person eating it knows they've wrung every last bit of value from that rare roast. The pickled beetroot sandwich takes 16th spot. Here, sharp slices of pickled beetroot from a large jar in the pantry are tucked inside bread to brighten up otherwise pale and heavy meals. The vinegar leaches into the crumb, turning it pink and adding a tang that slices straight through fat and starch. A single jar can pep up dozens of sandwiches, functioning as both a vegetable and a flavor booster. In homes where fresh salad is unthinkable, pickled beetroot delivers color, acidity, and a faint sense of luxury to a basic slice. At number 15 sits the mashed PEA sandwich. Dried peas are soaked and cooked, sometimes turned into something very like peas pudding, then mashed and spread thick on bread with a little fat stirred in. The result is dense, pasty, and incredibly filling. A bit of salt or vinegar can give it a lift, but even unadorned, it keeps workers and children going much longer than you'd guess from its modest look. It's a humble, heavy layer that quietly packs in a decent amount of plant protein. Taking 14th place is the fish paste sandwich. Strong, salty fish paste, made from ground fish scraps and oil, is spread ultra-thin so that a tiny amount can carry flavor across several rounds of bread. The taste is powerful enough that you don't need more than a smear. Even a hint on the tongue feels like a full fish tea. For families both on the coast and far inland, small jars or tins of fish paste become pantry fixtures, especially when there's no fresh fish to be had and children still need something with a bit of protein between their slices. At number 13, we find the kipper sandwich. Flaky smoked herring is broken up over buttered bread, serving as an affordable protein fix in coastal and northern communities. One kipper can be stretched out across several slices, its smoky oil seeping into the bread and carrying the flavor into every bite. The aroma is unmistakable. Once that paper parcel opens on a tram or in a break room, everyone knows what's inside. For the person eating it, that strong smell is a badge of honor. It means real fish at a price they can manage. Coming in at 12 is the spam or tinned luncheon meat sandwich. Here, paper-thin slices of tinned meat are carefully laid over bread, rationed across as many sandwiches as possible. A single tin is expected to feed a family over several days. This luncheon meat arrives with a promise of convenience and a long shelf life, and for many households, it effectively becomes the only meat that appears during the working week. Folded into bread with margarine or a dab of pickle, it tastes mostly of salt and fat and a distant echo of a ham. But crucially, it's meat you didn't have to queue for at the butcher's. At number 11 is the corned beef and onion sandwich. Tinned corned beef is finely minced and mixed with a generous amount of sharp onion so that a relatively small portion of meat appears to go a very long way. The onion's flavor and aroma do much of the heavy lifting, making thin rations feel plentiful. Piled onto slices, the mixture turns into a filling that tastes hearty, even when the tin has been stretched beyond what any recipe would suggest. For many people, this is the closest thing to a proper meat sandwich they see between paydays or when ration books are running low. The black pudding sandwich holds 10th place. This is made by frying slices of blood sausage until the edges crisp, then tucking them between bread, sending a fully portable form of black pudding frugality into miners' and foundry workers' lunch tins. Since black pudding is built from blood, fat and cereal, it transforms parts of the animal that others might discard into rich, concentrated fuel. In sandwich form, it is easier to eat in a pit or on a factory floor, and every bite carries iron and calories. It tastes of strength, struggle, and making sure nothing good is thrown away. At number 9, we come to the liver and onion sandwich. Last night's fried liver and onions are cooled, sliced and folded into bread for the next day's meal. Offal-like liver costs far less than prime cuts, and when cooked up with onions and gravy, it becomes palatable, even comforting to most families. Children may not list it as their favorite, but they grow up understanding that this is what real food looks like in a working-class home. Practical, frugal, nothing wasted, and full of iron. The liver and onion sandwich is offal economics made portable. In 8th place is the emergency egg sandwich. A hard-boiled egg is chopped and mashed together with a bit of fat, some scrap cheese or leftover dripping, then seasoned with whatever you can find. This is the fallback you assemble when the pantry is nearly bare. One egg extended across multiple slices, so it still feels like everyone has had a proper sandwich at tea time. For many mothers, the emergency egg sandwich is the final card to play before admitting there is nothing left on offer but plain bread. At number 7 sits the egg and cress sandwich. One EGG is stretched further by combining it with a generous load of homegrown cress from a pot, jam jar, or seed tray on the windowsill. The peppery leaves add crunch, freshness, and volume, and children proudly take these sandwiches to school, knowing they helped grow part of their own lunch. It's a tiny amount of protein backed up by a lot of greenery, and a reminder that even a sliver of soil or an old tin on the sill can produce something edible. At 6th place, we find the watercress and margarine sandwich. This pairs cheap, peppery watercress with a thin smear of margarine, appearing in thousands of packed lunches across the country. Watercress, once nicknamed poor man's bread, stays available along rivers and in markets, while margarine undercuts butter on price. Together, they form a sandwich that looks light on the plate but quietly supplies vitamins and enough fat to hold off hunger between shifts. Many people who grew up on these had no idea later generations might look back and consider them almost fashionable. The brown sauce or ketchup sandwich comes in at number 5. When there's nothing left in the house but condiments, plain bread drowned in HP sauce or brown sauce, or ketchup, becomes the final filling you can offer. The fierce tang and sweetness of these bottled sauces convince your tongue something substantial is happening, even though the only real substance comes from the bread itself. Kids turn it into competition, bragging about whose sauce is strongest or whose family buys the proper brand, using bravado to cover the fact that this is all there is. Adults eat these sandwiches in quiet resignation, fully aware that when you're down to sauce and bread, times are genuinely tight. At number 4, we have the cold tea-soaked bread sandwich. Stale bread is dipped into cold, sweetened tea, the dregs left in the teapot, and then layered up, creating a strange cross between a drink and a meal. The tea softens the crusts and brings tannin and sugar to transform dry ends into something just soft enough to chew without complaint. For many, this flavour is tied to exhausted evenings and hard decisions. The last of the loaf and the last of the tea, combined purely to hush the loudest pangs of hunger. Not even the bottom of the pot is wasted. The plain margarine sandwich sits in third place. Here, just a thin smear of margarine on bread is enough to qualify as a proper sandwich when the meat, cheese and jam have all disappeared. Margarine's low cost and long shelf life make it the default spread in countless homes. A thick layer becomes a luxury. Most people learn to drag the knife so lightly that the bread only barely loses its dryness. It is not exciting and never intended to be. It is the everyday baseline against which every other filling is measured. At number 2 is the dry bread sandwich. 2 slices of bread packed around extra bread or crusts scarcely deserve to be called a sandwich, but the name makes it feel like more than mere scraps. Parents fold ends and heels inside softer slices so they can still tell their children they have had sandwiches for tea, rather than admitting it is just the last of the loaf. On the page it sounds like a punchline. In real life it is a way of clinging to a little dignity when there is almost nothing left to eat. Finally, in first place we reach the single slice bread sandwich. Here, a single slice of bread is simply folded in half to pretend it's a sandwich at all, marking the absolute rock bottom of Great Slump lunches. You keep calling it a sandwich because the word itself is comforting, even though there's nothing between the two halves. Children who grew up eating folded slices with no filling at all never forgot what that signified. As adults, they save bits of string, rinse out jars, flatten and reuse foil, and refuse to throw away any food that can still be eaten. Each careful habit rooted in the memory of that one folded slice. Here's my challenge to you. Try one of these sandwiches this week. Just one. Not the folded single slice sandwich, never that, but maybe a sugar sandwich, an egg and cress or watercress and margarine sandwich in summer, or even a condensed milk or brown sauce sandwich that sounds ridiculous on paper but somehow works in real life. Then come back and tell me if I'm completely wrong. Tell me whether your great-grandparents were simply desperate, or whether they actually understood something about British food, thrift and survival that we've allowed ourselves to forget. Drop a comment with the one you're going to try. I want to know if spam, kipper or black pudding sandwiches still show up on Friday tables, and whether the idea of a single folded slice means anything to people whose families never spoke about the Great Slump. Because these weren't just sandwiches, they were survival strategies. They were little acts of hope. They were proof that British families could turn almost nothing into a meal and still call it dinner. Your great-grandparents knew that. Now you do too.